El Salvador Prison has the honor of being one of the worst prisons in the world. But what actually goes down there? What is it like at the new mega prison? It is a big mystery. But that is where we come in. We have cracked down on this mystery to give you a special sneak peek into the world's most horrifying prisons of all time. That's not all. We will discuss all the reasons why this prison is so scary that even hardened gangsters are terrified of stepping foot in there. So without any further ado, let's get cracking at this mysterious prison that has everyone on the edges of their seats. What is the El Salvador prison? Before we unfold the mess of what goes inside the prison, let's first discuss the geography of the prison. Trust me, you will get a better understanding of why this prison is so unpopular. In the most faraway land of Tecoluca, San Vicente, El Salvador, there is a prison that scares even the toughest criminals. The prison is in a very secluded spot that no one can spot from the naked eye unless they are being driven to the center. Away from all public institutions, centers, and any contact from the outside world, this center stands tall. The prison is more commonly known as Terrorism Confinement Center in the country. There is a 410-acre land dedicated to this facility, while the building only holds a smaller chunk of that land. Around 57 acres of the plot is covered by the physical complex of the center, while the rest is just a large piece of dry land. There are about 19 guard towers surrounding the prison blocks, with soldiers stationed to watch every move of the inmates. To top it all off, the compound is covered by 2 concrete walls and 2 electrified fences. There are about 7 rings of security, including patrol zones and a large perimeter wall. Nobody can even dream of leaving the prison building, let alone pull off an escape. But that's not the worst of it. The whole facility houses a separate building for prison guards and a factory where the inmates could work. So the actual prison has only about 11 acres of land, which is equivalent to just 6 football pitches. Now, the estimated number of prisoners that can fit inside the facility is over 40,000. If you put that in comparison to other prisons, El Salvador's prison is only a quarter in terms of land. When you get inside the prison, the situation only worsens. There are 8 main blocks, out of which 2 are working spaces. So, the prisoners only reside in the 6 cell blocks. That's it for 40,000 inmates. The cell blocks have tens of modules where the inmates live, but it is not a pretty sight, even for a prison. Each module houses 2 toilets, 2 basins, and 80 bunk beds. You may think that is livable for criminals, but turns out there is another problem. Often, the inmates living in each module are well over 100, even though there are 80 beds. More often than not, the bunk beds do not even have mattresses. It is like a torture cell more than a prison, and some of the inmates have to live in the prison for decades. Plus, the basins do not always have water. Inmates can use the basins anytime they want, but the guards control whether the inmates are behaving well enough to get the water that day. You cannot hope for a luxurious life if you have done a crime, but man, this is bad even for an inmate. Sounds bad? Well, that is just the main blocks. This place looks like a 5-star hotel compared to the solitary. Away from the main cell blocks, there are corridors for solitary cells. It is one thing for an inmate to be living in solitary at a bad prison, but imagine the solitary centers at one of the worst prisons in the world. These cells in El Salvador are completely isolated with a concrete slab as a bed for sleeping. There is no light that can enter the room, whether it be sunlight or artificial light. It is always dark and always lonely for days. There is a toilet and a basin, but you have to do everything in the dark. There is also a small window that only the guards can open or close. It can help them peek inside at the inmate to check if he is still alive for the torture of the next day. The state of the prisoners might be terrifying, but it is not like that for the guards. They are well taken care of in the facility. There are 1,000 guards, and each of them is responsible for about 40 inmates. That may seem like a huge number, and to be honest, it is. Most prisons only allow 7 to 8 prisoners under the scrutiny of a single guard. But maybe the guards here are much more experienced? Doubt it. 250 police officers and 600 soldiers are also positioned to give the guards an extra hand for security reasons. In a separate building, there are resting quarters, lounge areas with ping-pong tables, bathrooms, lockers, and a gym for the guards and officers in uniform. reforms. You can see why the prison holds the crown for being the most populated prison in the world. It was designed that way. But why? Why was it even built in the first place? Doesn't it look like the builders wanted to take revenge on the inmates? You might think that's not true, but the El Salvador facility does have historical evidence to support that statement. Why was it built? It all started in the 1990s when the two gangs started gaining momentum in El Salvador, Mara Salvatrucha MS-13 and the 18th Street gang Barrio 18. These gangs originated in California in the 1980s and were started by immigrants from Central America. However, due to the increasing violence, the leaders of both gangs were deported by the United States government. But that didn't put an end to the gang violence. It only transported the mess from the United States to El Salvador. They were not the only gangs that led to the terror that reigned in the country after the deportation. Other names like the Mau Mau, Miranda Loca, and La Maquina were all part of the chaos that had infiltrated the country. But the two major gangs kept everything on the verge for destruction. MS-13 was twice the size of Barrio 18 and hence was the main target for the government. The authorities came up with a clever way to pipe down the violence and cool down the rivalry between the two gangs. They paid $25 million to MS-13 as a part of a truce that was supposed to last 2 years, from 2012 to 2014. The idea was that the homicidal rate raging recklessly in the country would be halted, but things did not go so well. The truce received a massive amount of criticism from the people. A lot of them debated over whether it was even legal to do this, but sometimes the last resort is the least wanted option. The issue was that the truce was unreliable from the start, and with the negative attention that it got, it had no way of surviving. The MS-13 started claiming that the massive amount of money was kept by the leaders. Tensions had started brewing, and there was no way to force it down. So by 2014, the truce broke, and then ensued one of the worst times for the country. If you take a look at the murder rate in the year 2015, you will be hard-felt to believe this is not a war zone. The homicide rate was climbing up to 100 victims per every 100,000 people. This alarming rate was the highest in the world. There was no mercy left on the streets. The gangs were in control of everything that ran around the neighborhood. They would terrorize the public, and there would be no law that would pin them down and police strong enough to arrest them. The rates of extortion were high, and anybody who would not succumb to the orders of the gang would find themselves being tortured or at the end of a gun. The MS-13 gang members had started attacking the cocaine traffickers. They would invade the drug routes and claim control over those pathways, causing more tension in the underworld, which in turn led to more violence. The crime rate kept climbing until the government had no choice but to take drastic measures. In the year 2022, a day came that changed the course of history for the people of the country. On March 26th, the gang violence rose so high that 62 victims had the ill fate of being murdered on the same day. It only kept getting worse, and within 2 days, around 87 people had died. The government had to take action, and they chose a route that obliterated the gangs to their roots. President Nayib Bukele stated that the country is being exempted of law for a few days in the name of public good. There were some constitutional rights that were being waived off to get a hold of the gang members. He had called war on the gang members and started a crackdown against them. It was basically the purge that had started, and the clocks of laws and human rights in the country were stopped. The government is expected to arrest over 50,000 gang members. Some debate that the number is way larger and crosses the 62,000 mark. Due to the large influx of gang members, there had to be a prison which could host all these inmates. So the government got to work and created the El Salvador mega prison in the remotest pieces of land away from the public eye. The number of people in the prison as claimed by the authorities is around 12,000. But seeing the massive crowd that was arrested puts a lot of doubt on that statement. Plus, there were reports of the government arresting people who had the tiniest of alleged affiliation with the gang members. Even children were not excused from this law, and around 1,600 children were detained as a result. Now, you might have a different opinion about whether or not it was the right thing to do, but the people of El Salvador definitely agreed with the crackdown. According to a survey, about 90% of the population supports the mission that the president took in 2022, but arresting the prisoners was not the point of the mission. As you might have pointed a while back, the guards were given way more preference than the prisoners. This is because the government wanted to turn things around. The old days used to have the guards sleeping on the floor, while the inmates used to rule in prison due to the power the gangs held. To make a defining statement, the prison guards were provided with a better environment than the inmates, and so this cursed prison was born. What happens behind the closed walls here is a big mystery. There have been many secret reports, but none of them paints a good picture. Terrifying punishments at the prison. The inmates in El Salvador all scream of the terror that goes inside the prison facility, and it has the world divided on whether or not it falls within the scope of human rights. Let's get into it so you can decide for yourself. The access to the facility is not open to anyone. You cannot just waltz around in there even if you have a press badge. Recently, BBC was allowed into the prison, but it was a very controlled footage, and the prison guards were wearing ski masks to hide their identities. But there have been a few survivors who have given the world a sneak peek into one of the world's deadliest prisons. They were termed innocent and freed from prison after a few months. But the horrors they reported of the torture they faced for only a short number of months sheds a light on what is actually going on behind the walls of the El Salvador prison. It is not pretty, and the world agrees. The questioning living conditions of the inmates. When the early footage of the El Salvador prison came out, the inmates all had shaved heads and were forced to kneel down as the picture was taken. They were barebacked, and armed guards would stand above them holding their guns. It should have given an insight on how the inmates were going to be treated, but the world failed to recognize it until it was too late. Reports started coming in much later, and they kept piling up about how the conditions of the inmates were worsening over the years. The members of the rival gangs were put together to insult them. It was to break the communication lines between the gang members that could have potentially caused a riot inside the prison. Now, this may seem pretty reasonable, but everything down from here is going to sound pretty crazy and devastating. There have been numerous reports about how the inmates are being deprived of their basic rights. As we mentioned before, the guards had complete control over water and how much of it was given to the inmates. Let's just say they were adamant on abusing that power. Survivors claim that the inmates were only allowed to drink 1 cup of water each day. To add to that, they would not be allowed to have any utensils on their tables when they ate food. Apparently, anything could be used as a weapon, and the armed guards could not afford this. So the prisoners were forced to eat with their hands. However, the authorities inside the prison probably thought that it was not enough torture. So they came up with a technique so harrowing that it puts the humanity of the guards into question. The inmates would often be starved. That was the cue for prison guards to come with buckets of food and endless mocking. They would come near the bars and ask them politely if the inmates were hungry. Regardless of how they responded, the prison guards threw buckets of food onto the ground, spilling it everywhere. The floor would be covered in filth and mud, and the guards would order them to eat it with their mouths. If they did not comply with the orders, the guards threatened them with a beating. They would occasionally abuse them verbally too, until they started eating with their mouths, on all fours. When they were not inside their cells, it was not any better either. The prisoners were not allowed to see the light of the day. They were never allowed outside and forced to sit in the corridors if they wanted to be out of their cells. Even then, the prison guards would come up with brutal exercises and give them 30 minutes to complete the routine. Otherwise, they would face repercussions. Outside of those 30 minutes, the inmates have nothing to do except watch the time go by. Plus, there is the problem of lack of medical care in the facility. The authorities claim that there are 50 medical personnel ready to tend to the prisoners. But with regular beatings, there is little doubt that these doctors and nurses would be enough for the proper well-being of inmates. There was no access to medications, even if the inmates suffered from mortal diseases. A lady who was 50 years old had been a victim of liver disease. Her family would bring her medications to the facility, but they would be thrown away before reaching the inmate. The guards would tell off the families if they questioned too much. They used to reply harshly that the doctors in the prison would write her a prescription if she needed any medications. The troubling torture. Apart from the horrible living conditions, there were various forms of torture that had become the daily routine for many of the inmates. Threats were pretty common in the prison. The prison guards would be handing them out like business cards. Many guards would be heard shouting that the inmates would be lucky if they ever left the four walls of this prison. A couple of times when the foreign representatives were scheduled to come, the inmates would be warned ahead of the visit. Any minor complaint out of them would have meant a beating by the prison guards, with no one batting an eye at the torture. Even speaking out against the beatings meant death. But the complaints were not limited to speaking against the beatings. Sometimes not following the orders puts you in special isolation cells. Whoever complains, talks at night, or even shows the slightest disobedience would be sent to these cells. Sometimes all it took was the prison guard having a bad mood and it would come out on the prisoners. These isolation cells are very small, with no light entering into the four walls. There is no cot and often no toilets. The prisoners sent here are not allowed to bathe or have any water access. It is common knowledge among the prisoners that whoever went to these isolation cells would either come out starved or would not return at all. The surprising thing was that there was a malnutrition area. It was probably designed to fool the representatives who would come out here on a visit. If prisoners looked like they were malnourished, they would be taken to this area and treated quite well. But there is a storm after the calm, and for these poor inmates, it meant more beatings. One of the unlucky victims was beaten so hard that he suffered from a stroke about 20 days after he had been treated. But beatings were not the only forms of torture the guards had chosen for these inmates. The inmates were often forced into kneeling positions until the guards came carrying their batons. They would give them electric shocks randomly. One report claims that the guards would even draw blood from the inmates without reason. Once the inmates were through this torture, they would be beaten by the prison guards again. The horrifying thing was that the coroners were in on the torture. They would write fake medical reports of the inmates dying of natural causes, when in reality it was torture. One of the inmates, who was a 23-year-old woman, had multiple blows on her body. There were many fractures on her hands and feet and burn marks on her back. But when she was given to her family, the report said she died a sudden death. Similarly, there was a 40-year-old farmer who had been inside the prison for only 4 months. When he died, the cause of death was stated to be pneumonia, but his condition said otherwise. He had multiple wounds on his body, and he had lost so much weight that he was not even easily recognized by his family. Another woman, aged 42 years old, was reported to have died of septic shock by immunosuppression caused by nasal carcinoma, but her family had no clue that she even had cancer in the first place. The widespread executions around the prison, the punishment in the El Salvador mega prison is so rough that there have been reports of multiple deaths inside the prison. Official reports claim that the number is around 153, but others report that the number is much, much higher. The medical legal reports report that out of the 153 deaths, 29 died violent deaths, and 46 died of probable violent deaths. All the inmates who have died had multiple wounds from beatings, but the most deaths of inmates were due to mechanical asphyxiation. Many of the victims were reported to have been strangled or choked due to mechanical asphyxiation. It used to be a form of torture during the Civil War, and it has been sadly adopted again by the authorities. The troubling thing is that not all of the inmates in the prison might be guilty. Some of them were detained for alleged connections with the gangs, but those relations were never proven. And what's worse is that there is no way for them to fight the allegation. The inmates are often thrown in front of anonymous judges in secret trials behind closed curtains. They do not get represented by any lawyer or are allowed to challenge the allegation in court. Once you're a target, you can be behind bars for decades. There were a few exceptions where the innocents were freed under special circumstances, but their health was deteriorating to the extent that they died shortly after. A 24-year-old man was detained for 7 months until he was finally proven innocent. He had complained of stomach pains and was in critical condition when he was sent to the hospital. His family was notified and he was given a special trial. The judge declared him innocent but said that his health was troubling. He was suffering from chronic renal insufficiency by the time he was freed, and 2 days later, he had died. Another thing that validates the theory that there are far larger numbers of the deaths is the alleged presence of mass graves. Reports claim that there have been numerous inmates who were buried, and the families had no clue. Most inmates were handed with closed coffins, so the families would not see the condition of the bodies. One of the demands often raised by the relatives of the inmates is to ask whether their loved ones are alive. However, the whereabouts of the inmates remain unknown in most cases. They are then regarded as disappeared victims in the system. The reaction of the world. All of these reports do not have the world reacting positively to the punishments. There is a clear difference between rehabilitation and punishment, and the prisoners of any crime should be facing the former. Although human rights activists say that the rights of these inmates are being brutally destroyed, the country is not on the same page. A majority of the public agrees and applauds the ways the government treats the ex-gang members. While the purpose of a prison is to strip the inmate of his liberty, the El Salvador Prison has taken a pretty wrong perspective on it. There may be many horror stories that have been reported, but there remains so much more about El Salvador mega prison that is still a mystery. What are your thoughts? Is this the right way to handle these people who may have committed horrendous crimes? Or is there a better way to treat the inmates, no matter how horrible their crimes are? Let us know in the comments below. We would love to hear your thoughts. Don't forget to hit the like button if you enjoyed watching this video. Make sure you subscribe to our channel because we will be bringing many more exciting videos to your feed soon. Until our next video, stay tuned and thanks for watching.